Good morning again. This is Carter Conlon. Welcome to my morning. I think I have an interesting topic this morning. I want to talk to you about the pathway to power in your speech. The pathway to power in your speech. Let's start at 2 Timothy chapter 2, where Paul the Apostle is speaking to Timothy, his young disciple, beginning in verse 3. You therefore must endure hardship as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. In other words, Paul was saying to Timothy, as I'm saying to somebody today, the walk with Christ is not always going to be easy. You're going to have to plow through some difficult situations because you're fighting, in a sense, for the freedom of others, not just for yourself. And you're going to have to go through the fields of your own troubles and trials and choices, actually. And God says, but the end result of this is going to be, and I'm going to talk about this in a moment, you'll have power in your speech. No one engaged in warfare entangles himself with the affairs of this life, that he may please him who enlisted him as a soldier. In other words, the secular thinking of this world should not be what occupies your mind, but you and I should be occupied with the Word of God. And whatever God says, that's what we need to do, because we are representatives of the one who went to a cross to reconcile those who would turn to Christ unto himself. And if anyone competes in athletics, he's not crowned unless he competes according to the rules. The hardworking farmer must be first to partake of the crops. Consider what I say, and may the Lord give you understanding in all things. The hardworking farmer must be first to partake of the crops. Well, here's the way I read it. Don't ask, this is what the Lord told me when I was young, don't ask anybody to do anything that you're not willing to do yourself. And one of the habits I've had throughout my life, especially as a minister, is when I would prepare a sermon for Sunday, one of the things I would do, I would look at that sermon and I would say, are you living by what you're about to preach? And if I'm not, or if I'm writing just the edges of it, may I put it that way, are you willing to live what you're about to preach? Are you going to be the first partaker of what you're going to tell others to do? Now, I'm going to be telling you a story about a miracle that happened in Burundi, in Africa. But before I do, I want to talk about the choices I had to make to forgive. You know, this is a kingdom of forgiveness. We actually represent the one who went to a cross and said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they do. So the point being, if we harbor unforgiveness in our hearts, how in the world do we say that we're representing the one who went to a cross that we may be forgiven? It's the ultimate oxymoron. The two just don't go together. An unforgiving heart cannot preach the forgiveness of Christ, at least not with any power and without any authority. You know, I remember one time I walked into a church as a visitor. I was traveling, and the pastor was preaching on forgiveness, but he was such an angry man. It was obviously obvious. It was so obvious watching him that he harbored resentment towards somebody in the church that he had not yet dealt with. And yet he's red in the face, pounding the pulpit about forgiveness. And it's fairly obvious, at least to me anyway, that he hadn't forgiven somebody. I don't know what the issue was, but there was a deep unforgiveness in his heart. And because of it, there was very little conviction or power in his speech. In the early years of walking with God, I remember the Lord asking me to forgive, and some people in my life that I needed to forgive. And I remember how hard it was. But I made the choice because I wanted to do it God's way. And I remember going to an altar. I remember specifically falling on my knees. And when I said the words, I forgive, and I mentioned a name, just the flood of emotion and tears that kind of came from my life, and how clean I felt after. I felt free. I felt like a prison door that wanted to hold me had been opened. And over the years, I've had to do that again and again. And it's not always been easy. You know, forgiveness is not necessarily an easy thing, but it's a commanded thing. Forgiveness, to let the debt go, to forgive it, to say, look, you don't even owe me an explanation for what you did. I just forgive you. I release you of the debt. You owe me nothing. And the reality is, how do I even dare harbor resentment in my heart towards somebody else when I consider what God has done for me on the cross through his son, Jesus Christ? Many, many years later, the president of Burundi comes into our church on a Sunday when he's at a UN event. He asks me if I would consider coming to Burundi because he's afraid there's going to be another genocide there. There was this huge ethnic division between the two major tribes, the Tutsis and the Hutus, who are consistently slaughtering one another. When they get into power, they virtually eliminate or try to eliminate the other side. The last great genocide in Burundi had been a situation where Hutu people had actually invited, it was all pre-planned. And they told me when I got there, they had invited their neighbors, Tutsi neighbors, to their homes at a certain time on a certain day for fellowship or for dinner. And the plan was that they were going to slaughter the Tutsis, and they did succeed to a great degree. There was 300,000 people died in that particular genocide. That genocide spilled over into Rwanda, and almost 1 million people, 800,000+ people died in Rwanda shortly after that. The Rwanda genocide was so big that it eclipsed the start of it, which had been in Burundi. The president was a believer in Christ. He had come to Christ through some of the war that had erupted there. He was the third president in 1 year. And the previous two had been assassinated by military, their own military. You know, of course, it was still an ethnic contest, an ethnic problem going on. There was so much bitterness in the society. And he asked if I could come and address it. He said, I'll put you on national radio or television or whatever the case might be and give you an opportunity to speak to the nation, which he did. He did. He brought the whole government to the outdoor crusade. He refused the microphone himself when he was given the podium. He said, I didn't come here to speak. I came here to hear from God. A very gracious man. And I remember, but it began with the pastors. And I had a pastors conference with, it was well over 1,000 pastors. Some say closer to 2. I don't remember, to be honest with you, but I know it was a huge, huge auditorium of pastors. And I brought a message on forgiveness to them and basically told them, I said, if you are not willing to forgive, if you're a Hutu pastor here today, and that's probably all that our Tutsi pastor here today, and you're not willing to forgive those that have harmed your family or whatever your situation is, you really can't represent the Christ who went to a cross. You can't bring healing into your nation because you will become actually part of the problem and not part of the solution. And realistically, I was asking 1,000 or more pastors to forgive people who had actually killed their families. I want you to think this through. Some of them had come home to find their wives and their children or husbands and children murdered by their neighbors. And this is the situation we went into. This is the ethnic conflict that was threatening to flare up all over again. And at the end of it, after speaking as best as I could on the topic of forgiveness, I gave an altar call for any pastor that was in that gathering who wanted to forgive those who had done great harm to him or her or to their families or to their friends, whatever the situation was. And nobody responded. You could hear a pin drop in the place. And finally, after what seemed to be an eternity, it was probably only a few minutes, one man came out of his seat, came to the altar. Like the altar was a stage, and the stage was maybe, 3 feet high. And this one man came, and he knelt down, and he began to howl. I've never heard anything quite like it. It was the howl of a person coming home and finding their family had been slaughtered. There's no other way to describe it. It wasn't a cry. It was an actual howl. The pain was so deep that he just cried it out. And when he did, others started responding, and it started breaking out in different parts of that auditorium. And then people started flooding the altar. There were 2 men kneeling right in front of me, and both weeping profusely. So I got down on my haunches, my knees, and I just reached down. I grabbed the both of them like this, and their faces touched mine. I began to weep, and all of our tears started mingling that day, one with another. And then something after, I don't know how long it was. It could be 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes. And then suddenly people started rising up and they started dancing. The joy of the Lord just broke out in that place. The pastors forgave. People were running across the room, hugging one another. And from there, we went on to the field that night where you've got 30,000 people there. You've got 100,000 listening on the radio in a refugee camp for Tutsis in Tanzania. But you see, the pastors were the first partakers of this fruit of forgiveness, may I put it that way. Before even thinking of preaching it to others, they had embraced it. And when they embraced forgiving one another, a prison door opened in the nation. Something unlocked. And that night, a miracle happened. God came down. People were dancing in the field. I spoke on the same topic. Even the vice president of Burundi lifted his chair over his head and began to dance. The government leaders were there. The president was there. And a peace invaded that nation, which lasted for 11 years. That was all through President Nkurunziza's leadership tenure until he died of cancer. That's what God can do. The husbandman that labors must be first partaker of the fruit. So, my brother, my sister, if you want power in your speech, this is my point, I guess, today. If you want power in your speech, practice what you preach. Practice it before your children, for your friends, your colleagues in the office. If you're going to declare yourself to be a Christian, be a Christian. If you say you live by truth, live by truth. Be a partaker of what you're asked. Be the first partaker of everything that you're asking other people to do. I can honestly come to you this morning and say, I don't have an enemy or something in my heart that I'm aware of. Doesn't mean I don't have enemies. I'm just not aware of it because I've not harbored resentment towards anybody. I've forgiven everybody as Christ has forgiven me. And because of it, maybe in the future, God will even grant to me that I could have more power in my speech. That's really just up to him. But till that day, I'm going to do it his way. This is Carter Conlon. Welcome to my morning. And my morning, if you practice it yourself, will make yours and somebody else's day. Love you so much. I really do love you. See you again tomorrow.